So lots of really interesting issues to discuss with this movie and book, because we're discussing both. And are you guys bringing in the series as well, or just the movie and book?
I'm not familiar with the series.
I'm bringing it in a little bit.
Okay. So one of the and I have only seen the movie, so I will just say one of the themes I noticed in the movie that probably comes up in the book as well is this theme of like control, volition, discipline, things that have to do with the idea of control or lack of control.
Yeah, and so I definitely think that there's the overarching theme to me is definitely this fear, and because it is a horror book, of course, and so you always must ask with horror stories, where does the horror come from? And I think the horror of The Exorcist comes in the idea of not being in control.
Yeah.
And I think this plays out in a variety of ways. I think very directly with the fact that it is a possession story. Like Reagan, the little girl in it, is literally loses control of herself to this alien, the demonic entity, alien in the not in the extraterrestrial sense,
right.
Of course, so she's literally she loses control of herself slowly, but then also it plays out in we're presented with three distinct storylines throughout different characters in the book, and we're only presented with two in the movie, and the third one I'll get to interestingly. We see, first of all, Chris McNeil, Reagan's daughter, or Reagan's mother, sorry,
No
is watching her daughter slowly succumb to this demonic presence and is completely powerless to do anything to help. We also see that with Damien Karras, the priest that eventually helps perform the exorcism. He watched his mother, who was not demonically possessed, but was dealing with some ambiguous medical condition that they never really get into, but that she eventually died from. And so Karras watches his mother slowly wither and die, and he's not able to do anything to help her, which I think in that case is one of the things that helps his decision to actually help Chris and Reagan later on. But then there's a third storyline that we see only play out in the book, and that is the housekeeper Carl, who works with Chris, has a daughter with the female housekeeper Willie, who he keeps a secret from Willie. She thinks that her daughter is dead, but in truth, Carl's daughter is a drug addict. She's addicted to heroin, and Carl is trying to help her. And so once again, we see this theme of powerlessness and loss of control in Carl's story play out, and this theme of watching someone you love dealing with something, in this case an addiction, and he's unable to help his daughter. Thankfully, from what we know, up to the end of the book, his daughter does not die, but neither does Reagan. Damien's mother is the only one that dies in the story itself. But over every story presented has this idea of not being in control of a situation and watching someone you love go through something terrible and not being able to do anything to stop it.
And I wonder if that sort of trinity of plot lines is kind of echoed in some of the divine things that are going on, because this idea of like God the Father watching God the Son go to earth and not, being all powerful, but knowing that there's a certain plan that maybe goes against what they would want to do. And in that sense, the exorcism might seem, I was thinking in terms of like control, how much control they're trying to assert during the exorcism. And it's like a practice of ultimate authority. They keep saying like the power of God compels you, and it's all about authority, and it's all about the type of authority where you can only have one or the other and both can't coexist. And of course, being the kind of person I kind of always be like, can we talk to the demon first and see if it's okay and help it out, you know?
That brings up an interesting point with possessions, where it's touched on a lot more in the series than in the book or the movie, from what I saw, and that the possessee has to, in some way, consent to being possessed.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think that gets into how the demon first presents itself to Reagan.
Right. Do you feel there's permission given or not, or is that not the case in the movie?
Right. It's this idea of the demon comes to Reagan as this very friendly persona. Calls himself Captain Howdy, a very kid for you can imagine a clown, which I know clowns are horrifying in their own right. But there's this very innocent persona that I feel like there is an untold situation there where Captain Howdy endeared himself to Reagan so much that she kind of by default allowed him to continue the possession.
Any other thoughts on
and so and jumping off that point, I think another interesting thing and content warning for discussions of
and there will be a written one.
Discussions of childhood sexual abuse here, mentioning and speaking of control, for the way Captain Howdy Pazuzu, the demon, presents himself as this friendly persona to Reagan. Also, it kind of echoes real world predators, child molesters, who will present themselves in this innocent way, John Wayne Gacy was a clown. We were just mentioning clowns, and would would endear himself to the boys that he would later kidnap and murder and unspeakable horrible things. But then getting into the more darker stuff later on that happens in both the book and the movie. It's not even subtext to point out that the demon literally forces Reagan to commit sexual acts throughout the book, and so I think there is a very strong allegory of childhood sexual abuse, which also kind of brings about an interesting reading into a decision that the author made in regards to the priests that perform the exorcism, because the priests are Jesuits, which are kind of related to the Catholic faith, but they're kind of a separate sort of denomination. And I do think there is, thinking of this reading as an allegory for childhood sexual abuse might give light to the decision to have the priests be Jesuits, because it could be seen that having a story that serves as an allegory for child molestation and stuff like that, featuring Catholic priests as key protagonists, may be seen as in poor taste.
Sure, I can understand that. And speaking about sexuality issues, were you all mentioning some things about LGBTQ issues as well in the film or book or series?
In the book as far as the book, there seems to be at least one possibly out character, Father Dyer. Who, a lot of the time, he's in scenes, he's either doing something artsy, playing the piano at Chris's party, or flirting with Damien. He is also one of the few people who seems to be actually close to Damien, and one of the people he also seems to not actively despise, because Damien, as far as his personality is concerned, and as part of his struggle with his faith and everything, he doesn't like people as a whole. So so it's very interesting to see that he treats Dyer this way, with Dyer even telling him, hey, us queers are ditching the church, you might want to come.
Yeah, and besides Father Dyer, there are a few mentions of homosexuality throughout. Unfortunately, a lot of it seems to be like mentioned in opposition to the church. You have like the descriptions in the book of the black mass that the Satanists would perform, in which Satanists would engage in like quote unquote like homosexual erotic acts.
Sounds fun.
Right, but it's specifically meant to be obscene.
Right, yeah.
And so like homosexuality is kind of thought of as like obscene in nature throughout the book. But in terms of like actual, like when we're discussing like homophobia, it's interesting because direct homophobia is never, like, none of the characters, like the human characters in the story, like even like get near homophobia, but the demon, the like obvious antagonist of the story, insults Father Marin near the end by calling him, in the book he calls him a homosexual, in the movie he calls him warning for slur, like homophobic slur, a faggot. And so it is interesting to see that the only like direct homophobia in the story is from the antagonist of the film and book.
Well, if you have this kind of false dichotomy, like good, evil, sacred, profane, in terms of the church versus other, it seems like a situation where the way I would read it, obviously this may not be how it was meant to be read. I would see it as we're seeing this caricature, we're seeing this twisted version of sexuality, the way the church would probably see it, because they've always historically prescribed certain sexual acts as being okay and others as not being okay. And, to me, it's almost like, I see it as almost a sympathetic thing, that they're using that they're basically saying sex is unnatural and bad and evil, and homosexuality is part of that. I'm like, at least for once we're getting lumped in with the rest of sexuality,
Right.
I think it's interesting that, like, the demon would say, homosexual to Marin, and not something more along the lines of what probably would have been more offensive for the time that I guess he was worshipped as a deity of sorts, because then it probably would have been just something along the lines of, you take it up the ass. Defaming him as being, a bottom instead of...
Right, it wouldn't be as categorized as it is like in the movie,
Yeah. And that's the way a lot of like sexual issues are, like it's always framed through the church's like perspective, because like the author William Peter Blatty, the man that wrote the book, was Catholic, and so a lot of the like framing, it could be thought of very heavily from a Catholic viewpoint. And the story obviously gets no points for sex positivity.
Right.
Sex is pretty much universally, as you point out, seen as a negative in the story, whether that be homosexuality or heterosexuality. Just like sex is this dirty thing that we don't talk about. But then there is like the weird kind of not exactly sexualization from the author of Reagan, but there was something that struck out to me, and I had to make a note of it, was the very first word used to describe Reagan at the beginning of the book, when she is 11 years old, is pretty. That is the very first word we hear about Reagan is pretty, and it struck me that apparently, according to the author, the attractiveness of an 11-year-old girl is pertinent information to tell the audience. And if there are those out there who don't think that's like really an important point to bring up, I last time a male character was described first and foremost by his attractiveness, especially a child.
Yeah.